The sad reality is that I am not as in control of my life or of my world as I think. I'm not as in control of my life or my world as I would like. I call it a sad reality, but I sort of think that if I had eyes to see, I would see it not as a sad reality, I would see it as a marvellous reality, because it would make me realise that Jesus has got my back infinitely more than I realise. Let's see how far we get in our thinking this morning, but you can see that I'm working to the title, Jesus Alone is My Hope, and so I will trust in him alone. Mark 5 and verse 21 until the end of the chapter, there are two stories intertwined. So we have Jairus and his 12-year-old daughter who was seriously ill, but by the time Jesus arrived at their house, she had already died. And we have the woman who had a physical condition that meant her life was desperate. And both Jairus and the woman put all their hope in Jesus. But the previous two stories, if you just cast your eyes backwards, the previous two stories that Mark has recorded have exactly the same feature. Desperate, frightened, hopeless people totally out of control, finding their hope in Jesus. So if you cast your eyes back to the end of chapter 4, Jesus calming the storm, a boat full of experienced fishermen, but terrified fishermen. The boat was taking in so much water, the waves broke up over the boat. This boat was going down. Don't you care if we drown? The fishermen yelled at Jesus. Those fishermen turned disciples, they had no power over the wind and the waves. They had no power over their sinking vessel. No power. They were powerless. They were hopeless. And to the wind and the waves, Jesus said, "Quiet, be still." And to the disciples, he said, why aren't you trusting me? You can trust me, you know. You can put your hope in me because I am a sure hope. End of Mark chapter 4, beginning of Mark chapter 5, the next incident. We cross the lake and we find a man whose life is literally a living hell. He was out of his mind. He was controlled by evil spirits. He spent his days shouting and self-harming. In his life was no love, no companionship, no pleasure, no meaning, no purpose, no hope. And Jesus cast out the demons, transformed his life. Jesus brought order out of chaos. And then we see him putting his hope in Jesus. So my first heading, for people's experience, Jesus, their only hope. For different types of people, each totally vulnerable, totally desperate, totally hopeless, and each finding that putting their hope in Jesus was more wonderfully transformational than they could ever dream. But secondly, that tricky Old Testament illustration. Jesus is on his way to heal Jairus' 12-year-old daughter, but as we have said, on the way he encounters a woman, and Mark tells us, verse 25, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. The term period poverty is increasingly being used. Let me quote Wikipedia. Period poverty is a term used to describe a lack of access to proper menstrual products and the education needed to use them effectively. In total, there are around 500 million women and girls that cannot manage their periods safely due to lack of menstrual products and for fear of shame. And if you search the internet, you will find some great charities that seek to address that very specific issue. Well, this woman's condition is not monthly, it is constant. And it has been for 12 long years. Maybe, and I'm completely guessing here, I haven't read this anywhere, I'm absolutely guessing, maybe it started when she was 13, which means that she's still only 13 plus 12, 25. And if that was the case, all her teenage years, half of her life, was blighted by this painful and embarrassing and alienating and messy and energy-sapping condition. In a hot Mediterranean country with rudimentary sanitary protection and no private bathrooms with hot showers, and doctors who, yes, took her money, but no, could do nothing for her. The woman's encounter with Jesus is simple and uncomplicated and life-changing. She is desperate. She has come to the conclusion that Jesus alone is her hope. Even if the doctors could help, she had no money left. And she says to herself, if I just touch his clothing. Loads of people would have been touching Jesus as they rushed along with him in the crowd to Jairus' house. But this touch was known by God and anticipated by God. The woman's desperation and hope in Jesus was known by God and anticipated by God. And so when she expressed that hope by reaching out, God the Father released the healing power of Jesus, and she was instantly healed. Let's be clear. Jesus wasn't. Jesus isn't. Some bit of exposed electrical cabling with 240 volts shooting through it so that people could indiscriminately touch him and get a jolt of healing? No, something incredibly intimate is going on here. The woman realized that Jesus alone was her hope, and she trusted in him alone. And God the Father, seeing and knowing all of this, healed her through her son Jesus, through his son Jesus. Verse 30, once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him, he turned around in the crowd and asked, Who touched my clothes? You see the people crowding against you, his disciples answered, and yet you asked who touched me? But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Verse 34, 2 words especially there made me stop and ponder. Daughter and peace. Daughter, that's an unexpected word for Jesus to use. Madam, your faith has healed you. Friend, your faith has healed you. But daughter? Just think of the ages here. Jesus is in his early 30s. The woman is a minimum of mid-20s, so not much younger than him, or maybe she could have been much older. Why is Jesus calling her daughter? Well, very quickly we remember the teaching of the rest of the New Testament, that when we become followers of Jesus, we become adopted into God's family. We become an adopted daughter or son of God the Father. And peace. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. I would have understood why he'd have said, be freed from your suffering. We understand that in the context of her physical healing. But why did he say, go in peace? And then we remember that peace in the Bible means so much more. It means holistic peace, fundamental to which is being at peace with God. We are no longer, using the Apostle Paul's language, we are no longer his enemy. So something much more than physical healing is going on here. And the clue is in my heading, that tough illustration from the Old Testament. That strange passage from Leviticus, one of the early books of the Bible. Leviticus was written directly after God had rescued his people from Egypt. He'd taken them through the Red Sea. He had given them through Moses the Ten Commandments. And he was now teaching his people about himself, teaching them what it meant to be the people of God. And he gave them, in that context, ways to live that would teach them. So, for example, not mentioned in this passage, but I think we're broadly aware of it, he said to the people at that time, don't eat pork. Not because there was anything wrong with pork, but lesson one, I want to teach you that you need to be different from the rest of the world. And so we're going to practice that by doing the simplest thing, not eating pork. But lesson 2 is that you need to be different by being holy. And once you've started to grasp lesson 2, we can drop lesson 1. Because it's made its point, it's had its day. Which is the teaching of the New Testament apostles. They said the pork rule is no longer needed because we've grasped the point that it's really about being different. Lesson 1, we don't need lesson 1 anymore. It's lesson 2 what counts. We need to be different, not by eating pork, by being as holy as the Lord Jesus. But another lesson that God wanted his people to grasp was concerning the opposite of holiness, which is sin. And he wanted them to know how debilitating and horrible sin is. And the illustration that God used for this wasn't pork, but blood. And his point was that sin is as debilitating and painful as the monthly cycle. He was saying that sin is a bit like menstrual blood. And to drive it home to those specific people at that specific time in the learning process of God's people, such blood resulted in a restriction to someone's ability to worship. Now, to be absolutely clear, I know I don't need to say this, but I will say this. God was totally not saying that the monthly cycle was sinful or shameful or anything like that. On the contrary, it is part of a woman's wonderful reproductive framework. God was merely using blood as a visual aid, a very graphic illustration, saying that our sin is similarly painful and debilitating. Our sin excludes us from worship. Our sin excludes us from having a relationship with God. Now to our 21st century ears, that's a fairly tough Old Testament illustration. It isn't one I would, choose to do at an all-age service. But we can see how it sheds a new light on what is happening in Mark chapter 5. The most debilitating condition I will ever have is never going to result from my physical body, is never going to result from any of the circumstances in life that I face. My most debilitating condition is always going to be as a result of my bad attitude towards God, which more often than I care to admit is lukewarm and sometimes blatantly defiant. And the story of the woman here shows us that even in this area of my life, Jesus is my hope. And so I properly and confidently trust in him alone to cleanse me and heal me and restore me and change me and to make me his adopted daughter or son, and to enjoy peace, not just for the moment, but for the whole of eternity. Mark 4 and 5, 4 stories. Who is my only hope in the face of the uncontrollable storms of life? It is Jesus. Who is my only hope given all of the evil that is in the world? It is only Jesus. Who is my only hope in the light of my own sinfulness? It is only Jesus. And as we shall see next week, as we look at Jairus' daughter, who is my only hope as I face death itself? It is only Jesus. And so my third heading, but in a sense I've said it already, peace and freedom. What is my only hope for peace and freedom in this life and the next? It is Jesus. And therefore it would be good to ask, wouldn't it, what threatens my peace and freedom? It is the lure of other hopes. Where else do I find myself putting my hope? Who else, what else, where else do I find myself looking? I've been pondering this much over the last few days, and I wonder whether part of our issue is not truly appreciating what life without Jesus looks like. My only hope is Jesus. Well, I know that. You know that. But have I truly grasped how completely dysfunctional and indeed destitute I am without him? And so I find myself living a sort of muddling my way through life, hoping for the best sort of life. I am, as Disney encouraged me to do in all their films, I find myself believing in myself. I am believing in myself, which is not Jesus alone is my hope. And so I will trust in him alone. But I do find myself pinning my hopes on myself and the lifestyle I have been building and the family I have nurtured around me and the plans that I have and the dreams that I am pursuing. We could all make a list of the places and the institutions and the people and the dreams we pin our hopes on. But in the cold light of day, we well know that not one of these will adequately protect us from the storms of life and the evil of the world and the devastating ugliness and alienation from God that our sin causes, and not one of these things will protect me from death. But Jesus, on the other hand, oh, people of God, what do you see of Jesus in the story of the woman? The Jesus who was willing to be interrupted by her on this important journey. The Jesus who had a heart for a lone woman in the crowd that everyone else was avoiding. The Jesus that was so gentle with this woman. The Jesus who transformed her life both for now and for eternity. The Jesus who called this woman daughter. The Jesus who guaranteed her peace and freedom. The woman whose only hope was Jesus and who therefore hoped in Jesus alone and as a result received a hope that would never diminish. My brothers and sisters, I am not in control of my life. But upon reflection, I realise that someone far more wise and kind and good is in control of my life. And the same is true for you. Jesus alone is our hope. And he calls us to trust in him alone.